Hey everyone, welcome to Logan's Mosh Pit. Glad to have you here. Do me a favor and please subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks a lot for tuning into a new episode of Rock and Read. Today we'll read Chapter 3 of The Lives of Brian, written by the lead singer of AC/DC, Brian Johnson. Chapter 3 is called P-38. Here we go. My mother's homesickness finally started to wear off after a few years at number 1 Beach Drive. Or maybe it was just that she had found an outlet for it, an Italian food importing company up in Glasgow, run by a guy named Pietro Fazzi, who had been thrown in prison with his brothers by the British during the war, then released after VE Day. The company had started out as a family ice cream shop and cafe in the 1920s, but one of Mr. Fazzi's sons realized they could make more money selling raw ingredients directly to restaurants and homesick Italians all over Scotland and the Northeast. Quite a few Italian prisoners of war had married in Britain and never returned home. We're talking things like Minucci pasta, Bertolli olive oil, proper salami, gallon tins of tomatoes, Parmigiano Reggiano, and Doppio Zero flour for pizza crusts. Whatever you wanted, if it was Italian and made your mouth water, Mr. Fazzi could get it. Once my mom found out this guy existed, she never looked back. Every Friday afternoon, my ma would call in her order from a phone box up the street, and I'd listen to her babbling away to Mr. Fazzi in Italian for what felt like hours. Then a few days later, a guy would show up on our doorstep to deliver her supplies, and my ma would look as happy as a kid on Christmas morning. Watching her prepare this food was just the best thing ever. My brother Maurice, a future chef, was especially transfixed by it. I mean, although the food in 1950s Britain had a dreadful reputation, the Geordies were rightfully proud of their soups, scones, lamb chops, English bangers, bacon sarnies, and Sunday roasts. Comfort food that I still cook at home today. But what my mother could do in the kitchen was something else. She used spices that we had never ever tasted before, made pastas from scratch that we had never seen before. Cooking was an outpouring of emotion for her, a way to remind herself of the life that she had left behind in Italy. I'll never forget the first time she made her Italian donuts. Bomboloni, they are called because they look like little bombs, on a Sunday afternoon. The entire family sat and watched that dough rise in front of the fire, a damp towel placed carefully over it like it was a Hollywood film. Then she kneaded it, cut it into little rounds, laid out the donuts carefully on parchment paper, then fried them gently in the very best oil that Mr. Fazzi could get. And then, out they came, all warm and soft and insanely delicious looking. And she cut out the centers as a special treat for the kids, rolled them in sugar, and ooh, you just couldn't believe how good they tasted. My brothers and I could have eaten 1,000 of them. And of course, the neighbors ended up smelling the bomboloni from halfway up the street, and they had never smelled anything like it before, so they all came running over. And by then, my mom was on her 3rd or 4th batch, so she starts wrapping the donuts up in old newspapers and handing them out, and before I know it, I'm taking them into school for Mrs. Patterson and Mr. Graham the caretaker, and everyone has stopped making fun of us for being Italian behind our backs. From then on, I didn't really mind that we were different. In fact, I started to quite like it. Every morning my ma would make proper Italian coffee after my dad left for work. The beans would come from Mr. Fazzi, and she'd grind them herself in one of those wooden box things with a twisty handle on the top. The smell was so good that you wanted to bury your head in the stuff. Then she'd brew one of those Italian pots of coffee on the stove, pour us each a little bowl of it, add a splash of milk, and drop in some little squares of toast. That was our cereal. I mean, were there any other kids in the Northeast who got to start their school days like that? She was a wonderful woman, my ma, always surprising us and delighting us with her recipes, all of which she had memorized. Always happy and smiling when us kids were around, always wanting us to see and do the things that she never could. Every so often, though, the old pain would come back, like the time I was playing soldiers with the broom and I charged and smashed her pastel pink chandelier in the living room, one of the few things that she had brought with her from Italy that hadn't ended up being stolen or pawned. It was the first and last time that I was ever scared of my ma. She wasn't just angry, she was absolutely livid. But as soon as the anger passed, all the sadness came out, and she grabbed me in her arms and cried. This would probably be a good moment to mention that my mother had another go at taking me back to Italy, only this time with some advance warning during the school holiday. I must have been 7 or 8. The only parts of the journey there that I remember are using a toilet on the train that emptied directly onto the tracks. The loudest toilet in the world, I named it, and being paralyzed with fear when we had to carry our suitcases over these narrow, wobbly planks on the cross-channel ferry at Dover. I was absolutely sure that we were both going to die. How my mother finally coaxed me aboard, I have no idea. But Italy was a revelation. The station we arrived at, Roma Termini, was this brand new modern masterpiece with a huge atrium and cantilevered roof like nothing I'd ever seen before. I was even more amazed by the Italian trains, which were diesel, not steam, and painted in the most beautiful reds, oranges, and greens. And when we got off the train, the terminal smelled of coffee and fresh bread, and there wasn't a single piece of litter blowing around. Nothing could blow around, in fact, because there was no gale blowing in from the North Sea, and it wasn't pissing it down. And I could feel something unusual on my face, something that I had never felt before. Heat from the sun. I felt like I had arrived in paradise. As soon as we got off the train, me dressed in my usual shorts with a pair of open-toed sandals, my ma's sisters and her niece Juliana showed up, and everyone cried for about 10 minutes. They were the loveliest, friendliest people I had ever met, and so incredibly beautiful, I couldn't stop looking at them. None of them wore nylons because their legs were naturally tan. Their teeth were straight and white. And their makeup was so subtle, you could barely even tell they were wearing lipstick. One of them even had a car and drove it herself, which I couldn't believe. Cars were rare enough in Dunston, but women drivers? I was in shock. My Italian aunties and cousin Juliana just seemed so free, so stylish, so happy. Then off we went to Frascati, which was about 45 minutes away up in the hills, and we passed all these burned-out German tanks and artillery pieces on the side of the road. Next thing I knew, we were pulling up outside an incredibly posh-looking block of flats, where it turned out my Auntie Maria had the whole top floor to herself. I was in shock at how she lived. I can still picture the silk curtains, which were pale light blue and gold, and the kitchen, which had a long table for cutting and preparing all this fresh and colorful-looking food. There were even vines of grapes just growing naturally in terracotta pots on the balcony, spilling over the side and creeping up the wooden latticework, creating a canopy of shade. That night we were treated to the most delicious meal of pasta, fish, meats, and cheeses that I had ever tasted, and I got to sit with Juliana and my other Italian cousins on a special children's table. They gave me a little beaker of red wine, and for the first time, the full weight of what my ma had given up for my dad, for all of us, began to sink in. If my mother was the soul of the family, my dad was its backbone. Getting so much as a hint of emotion out of him was like getting blood out of a stone. He grunted. He growled. Sometimes he bellowed. Mostly, he said very little at all. When he spoke to me, it was usually to say, "Oi, you, stop that!" or "Oi, you, get over here now!" For years I thought my name was Hugh. It wasn't that he was cruel, he just didn't want to be seen as soft, and that wasn't just a macho thing either. When you're a sergeant, discipline is everything. If you can't keep your men in line, sooner or later, someone is going to get killed. The first hint I got of what my dad had been through during the war came one Saturday afternoon when I was about 10 years old. One of my favorite things to do back then was to build an Airfix model aircraft, and on that particular day, I was putting the finishing touches on an American P-38 Lightning twin-engine fighter bomber, as the Germans called them, the fork-tailed devil. My dad had never taken much of an interest in my creations before, but when he came back from his club and saw the P-38, he stopped, smiled, and said, "That's the most beautiful plane in the world," which kind of shook me because he never usually said anything at all. "Why's that, Dad?" He said, "It saved our lives, that did." And that was it. I was expecting a story, but talking about the war just wasn't cool. It took another 20 years before I finally got an explanation. Years later, my brother Maurice and I were in Frascati, staying with Ma's family, with her and Dad. One afternoon, Dad said, "I'd like to go to Nettuno, which is not far from Anzio. This is where on January 22nd, 1944, the Allies attacked the German-held beachheads. The Americans at Anzio, the British at Nettuno, which is where my dad landed." So Maurice and I drove him to Nettuno. The drive from Frascati took about an hour. It took the Allies about 5 months. When we arrived, we were met by some of my ma's extended family who had an apartment right on the beach. They welcomed us, took us up to their balcony, and brought out this glorious spread of food. There were salamis, cheese, bread, and wine. Perfect. We looked out over the beach, drinking wine and taking it all in, when out of the blue my father said, "You see that rock?" About half a mile away, just before the beach met the water, stood a huge rock. We all looked and nodded. "We took cover behind that when we got out of our landing craft," he said. "There were bodies everywhere, floating in the water, on the beach. Men were dropping like flies. I told my men to run for that rock and stop for nothing. I don't know how we made it, but we did. Well, some of us did anyway." Maurice and I were stunned. This was the first time we had ever heard our dad talk about the war. Then out of nowhere, these P-38 Lightnings came swooping down and strafed and bombed the Germans, my dad said. They were the most beautiful things I had ever seen. I suddenly got it, all those years on from that Saturday afternoon. We then went to the Allied War Cemetery. Thousands of crosses with the Star of David here and there. It just took your breath away. I had never seen anything so sad and so beautiful at the same time. The flowers, the death all around, young fellows who gave everything they had. Nobody knew or cared where Nettuno or Anzio was. I felt quite ashamed when I thought about what I had wanted when I was their age. A new PA system, a motorbike. Those lads never got a chance. My father's shoulders straightened instinctively as he walked into the cemetery. Then he marched determinedly to a row of graves that he must have remembered from when the bodies were buried way back. Maurice and I followed him as he pointed to various headstones. "Ah, Tommy, he was a good lad. And there's Eric, a funny fella. I went to school with him, you know. And that's Mickey. He didn't make it 5 yards. We could see none of them had even made it to their 21st birthday. "Give us a couple minutes, lads," asked my dad, and we left him there with his fallen pals. We watched as he talked to them, all without opening his mouth, smiling now and then, nodding occasionally. The boys back together after so many years of silence. I hope he's with them now. There were tears in his eyes and lumps in our throats. Then he pulled himself up to his full height and gave a proper sergeant's salute, rigid and intense. No trumpets, no last call. Then he dropped the salute, did an immaculate right turn, and marched toward us. "I'm done," he said, and we followed him out. We looked at our dad in a new light after that. For all my dad's cantankerousness, there were only a couple times when I saw him really lose it, and on the occasion that it was with me, in all honesty, I had it coming. I had come home from school one afternoon and noticed this huge cloud of black smoke billowing out over the top of the house and thought, "What the is that?" So me and a few of the other big ones ran to find the source and quickly found the railway line, which ran directly behind our street and was separated from our back garden by just a little fence. This gave us the idea to create an incredibly fun new game, which the little ones also soon eagerly joined in with. The game was called Steam Train Chicken, which, as you can probably work out for yourself, involved us standing on the line and waiting for the train while listening to the driver blowing his whistle and screaming every curse word that he could think of at us, and seeing who could hold their nerve the longest before jumping out of the way. The closer you came to a horribly violent death, in other words, the better your chances of winning, which in our kids' minds seemed like an entirely reasonable gamble to take. Anyway, this game went on for weeks, providing us with endless hours of entertainment, until my dad looked out of his bedroom window one day and saw what was going on. Let's just say that his reaction wasn't one of fatherly pride. He didn't open the window and call out, "Brian, my son, what an exciting game you've invented there. Well done, little fella." Instead, as he stormed out of the house, he got the same look in his eye he must have had when he was killing Germans in Tunisia. He pointed at us in turn and roared, you, against the fence, now." Then he pulled down a tree branch and started whacking the out of us. "If I ever see you doing that again, whack. I'll call the police, whack. You'll go to prison. Do you hear? Whack." "Yes, Dad," we whimpered in turn, tears streaming down our faces, our arses on fire. Later that night, one of my friend's dads came to the house all riled up, demanding to know why his son had been beaten with a stick. But when my dad explained that he had been caught playing chicken with a steam train, the other dad went very quiet and said, "Well, I'm sorry for doubting you, Alan. If you ever catch him doing that again, please give him another good hiding from me." In 1950s Dunston, the stubbornness of the average working-class dad was a constant hazard and almost impossible to navigate. A prime example being the time my old man asked me to go over to his friend Billy's allotment to pick up a lettuce from my ma. In the late 50s, in all working-class areas in Britain, there were allotments. They were a throwback from the war. The idea was to grow your own food, and usually have a cree for your homing pigeons. Not far from Beach Drive, where we lived, there were literally hundreds of them, all about 40 yards by 25, give or take a turnip. These allotments were rented out by the local council, and all were surrounded by corrugated iron, and secured and guarded jealously by the tenants, especially when prize leaks were involved. My father's mate had one, and on a beautiful sunny spring day, Dad said to me, "Go to Billy's allotment and pick up a lettuce for your mother." It was spring, and that's when you ate salads because, unlike today, it was a seasonal thing. He gave me a 2p, and off I went. I knocked on the corrugated iron fence, but nothing. So I shouted because the fence was too high to climb. Billy came and said, "Come on, son, I've got a nice head of lettuce for your mom." It was wrapped in a newspaper, and I said to him, "Here's your 2p from Dad." "What?" he said. "There's no need for that. I have plenty. Off you go." I went home and proudly announced the lettuce was free. Billy didn't want any money. My father said, "Take that money back and tell him I always pay my way." A little confused, I ran back to Billy's allotment and said to Billy, "Dad won't take it for nothing, and here's the 2p. Billy laughed and said to tell Dad not to be so daft. "I don't need the 2p. Now go on and Bugger off. While buggering off, I realized this was a political game I was ill-equipped to deal with. What the was my father going to say? I must point out at this juncture that at the time in the Northeast, fathers were strict and were not used to being disobeyed, and I was just a pawn in the game of pride. I went back again to plead with Billy to take the bloody 2p. It was too late. He was gone. Panic set in. I couldn't keep the money or I'd be accused of stealing. I couldn't take it back or I'd be doing the allotment shuffle for all eternity. And this was a Saturday, and nearly time for the afternoon matinee at the Pitchers. So, this was what it was like to have to make a decision. The closest I had been to that was in a sweet shop, deciding between midget gems or pineapple chunks. I didn't like the decision making at all. It was confusing and scary. So I thought long and hard about what to do. About 5 minutes later, I had come to a conclusion and threw the money down the drain. I spent the next few days in sheer terror that Billy would talk to my dad and they would find out the truth, but nothing happened. Both of them were probably too proud to talk about it. I started realizing then that being honest wasn't that easy. The contents of an English salad from 1950 to 1965 were 2 leaves of lettuce, half a boiled egg, 2 pickled onions, half a tomato, 1 slice of meat, ham, spam, or tongue for a child, and lots of bread spread with margarine or dripping or the ubiquitous Heinz salad cream. The middle class used butter. Then the lettuce would disappear for another year, but time moves on, and hydroponics changed the lettuce world. We bred them like battery chickens, and both taste nothing like the originals, just like water. 1958 was the year that everything changed for me, in ways both awful and amazing. The awful part was that I had to take the 11+, a brain-meltingly hard IQ test that also included questions on everything you'd ever been taught in school. In Britain in those days, it's no exaggeration to say your performance in that one exam at the grand old age of 11 decided how the rest of your life would turn out. The high scores went to grammar schools that prepared them for universities. The rest went to secondary moderns, where the focus was on practical skills like woodwork and metalwork, and you had more chance of walking on the moon than getting a university education. There were also a few technical schools that taught trades, but most trades were learned through on-the-job apprenticeships. The exam lasted 45 to 60 minutes. You couldn't retake it. So the pressure was absolutely horrendous. It didn't help that Britain hadn't built enough grammar schools to handle all the kids born after the war, so every year they made the questions harder. My dad being my dad, the only kind of encouragement he knew was fear. "Oi, you! You better pass that exam, or you'll end up sweeping the roads," he kept saying to me. Sweeping the roads was the worst job imaginable as far as my dad was concerned. For me, though, the fate that scared me the most was becoming a coal miner. What my dad should have known, of course, is that you can't scare someone into doing well at something that requires preparation and a cool head, on top of whatever natural intelligence you were born with. And I didn't prepare at all for the 11+. But the truth was, I was also just very underdeveloped at that age, compared with my friends. I still hadn't grown out of playing cowboys and Indians, and I suffered from terrible performance anxiety. I still do. The whole thing was just a total humiliation. I got the exam papers in front of me and froze. I was so nervous my brain wouldn't work, and I couldn't make head nor tail of it. The questions might as well have been written in Swedish. It was one of the worst hours of my life. What made it even more painful was that I had been such a good student at school, always getting gold stars and top marks. We got the results about a week later. What a day that was. Suddenly everyone was separated into groups. In one group were the future pilots of the world, the doctors, the lawyers. Some of the high scores were friends of mine and had always come lower than me in class, but they obviously prepared for the exam and had been able to hold their nerve when it counted. But when my name was called, I was told to go and stand with the kids who usually got D's and E's. My heart sank. I had failed, obviously. I'd be going to a secondary modern. Not that it made any difference in the end. Even the hardest of blows you take in life can be overcome if you just play the hand you're dealt instead of moping around and feeling sorry for yourself. But I'm not going to lie to you. When the grammar school kids went one way and I went the other, I couldn't have felt more empty. A few weeks later, the amazing thing happened. I was off school on the day in question. I must have been feeling poorly or had a dentist appointment or something and was out of my mind with boredom. So I switched on the television and started watching this daytime BBC show with the very catchy name of Farming. That was it, just farming. Later on they'd spice it up, no doubt creating a whiff of scandal at Broadcasting House by renaming it Farming Today. Either way, it was just a guy in a suit and tie talking straight to the camera. In this particular episode about the difference between mulch and manure. Now at this point you might be asking yourself, why didn't this little lad just change the channel? But in the Northeast in those days, remember, the BBC was the only channel, with Tyne Tees television not launching until a year or so later. So it was either suffer through an episode of Farming in black and white just to add to the thrill, or stare at the wall. And I'd done as much staring at the wall as any 11-year-old boy could take in one day. So there I was, sitting and watching this mind-numbing form of entertainment, eyes glassing over, drool coming out of my mouth, when all of a sudden the credits rolled and this plummy-voiced BBC announcer said, "And now for the interlude." I almost certainly groaned, because if you can believe it, the BBC's interludes were even worse than the awful programming itself. Things like, here's a short film of fish swimming in a pond, or here's an elderly Scottish woman decorating a pot. And now for a church choir singing a hymn, very slowly. But not on this day, oh no. On this day, the gods of rock and roll had decided that little Brian Johnson and number 1 Beach Tribe was going to get a bolt of lightning up his arse. Instead of being treated to a short film of fish swimming, I suddenly found myself staring in awe at a black guy with a wafer-thin mustache and a crazy mop of hair. Oh, and he was wearing makeup and a sequined shirt with a skinny tie, and everything about him was just so obviously, wildly, fabulously gay. But of course, gay to me just meant happy, and it would for many more years to come. "This young American boy goes by the name of Little Richard," said the announcer, with a hint of mischief in his voice, like he knew this was far too racy for the BBC. "And here is his most popular song, which has been a terrific success across the Atlantic." Little Richard opened his mouth and let out a noise at the very top of his lungs that was just pure joy, sex, and liberation, all rolled into one. A wop, bop, a loo, bop, a wop, bam, boom. Many have described that song Tutti Frutti as the sound of rock and roll being born, which is fitting because my dream of becoming a singer was born in that moment too. I felt like someone had just plugged me into the mains. Every part of me was suddenly standing on end, from my hair to my nipples to the pits down below that I didn't even know how to use yet. It was like nothing I'd ever seen, heard, or felt before, and it absolutely blew my mind. Like all highs, though, Tutti Frutti was very quickly followed by a crushing low. Because I wanted, no, needed, to hear those scream lyrics and these unhinged woos and that full-throttle rhythm section again, immediately. But I was just an 11-year-old kid in Dunston. I was too young to go to a record shop. I didn't have any money. And even if the single had magically fallen from the sky, I wouldn't have had anything to play it on. Our ancient wind-up gramophone only went at 78 RPM. It was agony. Then a few days later, coming home from school, I heard the unmistakable shriek of rock and roll ecstasy carried down the street. I ran around trying to find the source, and when I realized that it was coming out of a neighbor's downstairs window, I jumped the fence and just stood in their front garden listening to it, mesmerized. Then it stopped, and to this day, I can't believe what I did next. I knocked on their front door. A lady answered in her curlers. I remember thinking that she seemed far too old to be listening to my kind of music, but she was probably only 19 or 20. "Sorry to bother you, missus," I said, feeling my cheeks turn bright red, "but could you play that again?" The lady looked back at me for a moment, not quite believing what she was hearing. "Well, if you like," she said with a little smile. Then she went back inside. I heard the crackle and hiss of a needle on vinyl, and then, "Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes, oh yes." A wop, bop, a loo, bop, a wop, bam, boom. Next thing I knew, the lady was back on the front step with me doing the hand jive to the music. That just floored me. It was the best thing I'd ever seen. So of course I joined in, and there we were, this kid who just failed his 11 plus, and this fully grown young woman on a council estate in Dunstan, and we were grinning our faces off to this totally alien sounding but unbelievably exciting new kind of music. It was hands down the best Tuesday afternoon of my life. "What's your name, sweetie?" asked the girl out of breath when the song ended for the second time. I told her. "Well, it was nice to meet you, Brian," she said. "I'm Annette." Annette, if you're reading this, many thanks for pointing the way. Well, that's the end of Chapter 3. Let me know what you thought of Chapter 3 in the comments below. That does it for today's video, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. I really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time. Till then, rock on.